This is what an anti-inflammatory whole food plant-based diet looks like. It's probably not what you imagine at all, because you probably think it's going to be bland, boring, and tasteless. Today I'm talking to Sid Notter, and we're going to be talking about how your diet affects your inflammation and what you can do about it.
Anything I share today is for general dietary information only and should not be construed as personal medical advice. I always like to start off with that. Inflammation is a natural reaction. It's our body's natural response whenever it detects the threat of harm. So it's kind of like the body's guard dog system in a way. And throughout most of human history, inflammation was considered to be a very good thing. But there are two types of inflammation, acute and chronic, and both types start with our immune system. That might be surprising to some of you. Acute inflammation is the body's response to an injury, like if we get a splinter or a cut or a burn, and you'll notice how the body's rushing immune cells to that area to start the healing process, and that's where we become red and inflamed. In fact, the word inflammation comes from the Latin word inflammare, which means to set on fire. That's why that area can get hot as well. So it's typically designed to protect us. Acute inflammation typically lasts only a very short time, and it's very localized, and it's a very specific response to an infection or that injury that we just talked about. And it's aimed at resolving a problem, right? The body knows that there's some problem going on and it's striving to resolve it. And that's just one way that our immune system is working to do that. Chronic inflammation, on the other hand, which is also called metabolic inflammation, is the body's way of protecting us against a threat that's always lurking in the body that shouldn't be there. So when something's lurking in our body, the immune system stays on high alert because it knows there's a threat somewhere, and it's sending out these immune cells to try to counteract that threat and begin the healing process. It's those activated immune cells that are always in our system that results in persistent, systematic, and chronic low-grade levels of inflammation that plays a part in so many of our diseases and ailments. So when inflammation overstays its welcome because of that overactive immune system, it's no longer protective to our system at that point. It can actually become very damaging. It's as though we're red hot and painful and it's swollen all over inside. And so the thing to remember is that inflammation always starts with the immune system, and it really is a double-edged sword because it's designed to protect us and begin the healing process when necessary. But it can also be very damaging when it overstays its welcome. So several things can contribute to chronic inflammation: tissue injury and damage, infections, irritants and toxins and pollutants, right? Our bodies recognize all of those things as a threat. Even being overweight can contribute to it because it turns out that our own fat tissues secrete these inflammatory cells called cytokines, and I'll talk about those again in a minute. But those cytokine cells are involved in many aspects of inflammation, including if we get a fever or pain, those cytokine cells are involved with that. Being sedentary increases our pro-inflammatory markers. Even smoking contributes to inflammation because nicotine activates these certain white blood cells called neutrophils, which in turn release inflammatory molecules. Having high LDL cholesterol levels contributes to it. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, chronic stress, and poor sleep, all of these factors contribute to inflammation because, again, the body is sensing some type of a threat. But by far, the greatest factor and primary driver of inflammatory chronic disease is what we're putting into our bodies at least 3 times a day, namely our food choices. So our food choices matter more than any other factor, including all the environmental toxins and even our genetics. Food matters more than that. So here's a little chart showing that chronic inflammation is associated with the majority of today's chronic diseases. And this chart is definitely not all inclusive, but pretty much every one of our everyday ailments has some link to inflammation involved to it. So let's get on to the foods right now and talk about foods that are inflammatory. So there's good news and bad news. Let's start with the bad news, right? Which foods are inflammatory? Processed sugar is the first one that we'll take a look at, specifically refined sugars, which are found in soft drinks and fruit juice and sweet tea and pastries, desserts, cookies, candies. Sugar stimulates the production of something called free fatty acids, which circulate through the bloodstream and trigger both insulin resistance and inflammation in the skeletal system, the liver, and those protective endothelial cells on the inside of our arteries. If you've ever followed Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn at all, the author of Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, you probably know that inside of our arteries is a lining called the endothelial lining, which is very protective. So sugar triggers the release of those cytokines, which can damage our endothelial cells.
What would you
So
say to somebody who said, "Oh, well, I don't care. I'm not going to give up all this stuff that I really like and that makes me happy just to reduce inflammation in my body. Why do I need to do this?"
it definitely is a choice. So I've got a spectrum, and I tell people it's up to you where you're going to land on the spectrum. Over here are the best foods for your health, and over here are the worst. And it's up to you where you're going to land on that spectrum. If you still want to have a donut once in a while and eat something sugary, that's your choice. Maybe you'll see that it affects your body, and maybe it won't. But that is something that each person will have to decide, and if they decide that eating sugar is more important than feeling good, then that's the choice they would have to make.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, isn't it? That people assume that eating things they like will make them feel good and will make them feel better than not having this inflammation in their body, which, as your chart showed, affects so many aspects of the body.
Yes. Right. I think that immediate hit of sugar, affects the dopamine in our brains, and that's why we think it makes us feel better. But that's a very short-term feeling, and then the effects of that sugar are going to be much more long-lasting and damaging to the body. Does that make sense,
Yeah.
Jane?
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh,
And that's my own experience as well, that as I've reduced the amount of sugar in my diet, actually now, if I have a day when I eat quite a bit of sugary stuff, I feel really horrible
mhm.
because I'm not used to feeling like that. And my blood sugar's all over the place. I'm a bit headachy maybe and a bit moody. Um, Whereas when you're doing it all the time, I don't think you realize the effect it has on you.
Exactly. Yeah, because you're not giving your body a break, right? You're always inflamed in a way. Those cytokine cells that I talked about, they can recruit other cells that also contribute to inflammation. So it's kind of a snowball effect. And they can cause symptoms like eczema, fatigue, arthritis, which just one can of pop has 40 grams of refined sugar. And the research shows that that is enough to increase the inflammatory markers in our body. In 2023, the average American was consuming nearly 30 teaspoons of sugar a day, 30. And that's 100 pounds of sugar per year. That's 2 pounds of sugar per week per person, when you figure the math out. And the United States is unfortunately the biggest sugar consumer on the entire planet, according to the research that I've studied on that. So the next thing that's very inflammatory are common oils. Now, Jane, what's your view of oils? Do you promote not eating oil, or are you okay with consuming oils in your line of work?
I'm I'm okay with consuming oil, but
Okay.
I tend to use olive oil so it's very cloudy.
Hmm.
So it has a lot of nutrients in it. But I know quite a few people who find their own health is much better without any oils.
Hmm.
I was talking to
Okay.
somebody recently with psoriatic arthritis, and she found giving up these common oils for her was the final bit of the puzzle of removing her psoriatic arthritis.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. So some people can get away with low oil, like not consuming a lot of oil.
Yeah.
Okay. So oils gained a lot of popularity back in the 1990s, partly because of the Mediterranean diet, right, which focused a lot on oils and red wine. But from now we know from a lot of studies that common oils, and sometimes I'm reluctant to call oil a food because really it's just the extracted fat from a food. Basically, all oils are pure fat. And it all comes from either vegetables or plants or fish. The oil has been extracted or pressed from those foods. And again, oils are found everywhere. Just one tablespoon of oil has 120 calories and 14 grams of fat. So we'll find oil in fried foods, a lot of packaged foods, margarines, which are typically all oils, salad dressings, bakery items, restaurant foods too are loaded with oil. And these extracted oils, we know from Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Ornish's work and others, they can damage that protective endothelial lining on the inside of our arteries that I talked about a little bit ago, paving that way for plaque formation. So they're highly inflammatory because of the large amounts of the polyunsaturated fat known as omega-6. So in our systems, omega-6 metabolizes into another form of omega-6, something called LA, linoleic acid, which produces these harmful prostaglandins and other fatty molecules that contribute to inflammation. So oils can impair our circulation. They have clotting factors that are equal to animal fat. They can promote insulin resistance and lower our good cholesterol. And they also have these direct toxic effects, again, on the endothelial cells, which line our arteries. So one study I found here, which was released in 2018, this was conducted at a heart institute in Kansas City. And the researchers looked at the effect of vegetable oils as a driver of heart disease. And they concluded with this statement, which ties into what we just were talking about. In summary, numerous lines of evidence show that the omega-6 polyunsaturated fat linoleic acid promotes oxidative stress, oxidized LDL, chronic low-grade inflammation, and atherosclerosis, and is likely a major dietary culprit for causing coronary heart disease, especially when consumed as vegetable oils. So what really caught my eye in that study is that the researchers stated that the intake of that omega-6 polyunsaturated fat can be even more damaging to our endothelial cells than saturated fat, which I found astounding. So that's one reason why we should consider oils. If we are suffering from inflammation, it might be one thing to consider eliminating for sure. And just a quick note here about coconut oil too, because it's very popular still to some degree in these days, but it's one of the worst because not only is it 100% pure liquid fat, just as all oils are, but 92% of it is saturated fat. So if we put that in perspective, a tablespoon of lard has 5 grams of saturated fat, and a tablespoon of coconut oil has 12 grams. So coconut oil has more than double the saturated fat as lard. And it's really important to understand why that matters so much, because saturated fat is rated by our top cancer researchers as the most pro-inflammatory food component in our diet. Got that? So saturated fat is the most pro-inflammatory food component. And of course, saturated fat is also a major contributor to plaque formation, type 2 diabetes, dementia, and so many other things. Right along in the same line as oils are trans fats, which really contribute to inflammation. They raise our bad cholesterol. Trans fats are hydrogenated oils, oils which have been heated and treated with hydrogen to convert from a liquid to a solid. So like shortening would be considered a trans fat. And again, they increase our bad cholesterol while reducing the good. So it's a double whammy there. They promote inflammation, obesity, insulin resistance. And even our government, who is typically quite lenient with food manufacturers, says there is no safe amount. Even the government says there's no safe amount of trans fats, which should tell you something if they're saying that.
Yes.
Processed meat, how do they contribute to inflammation? One of the biggest reasons is the high saturated fat content. Remember, we just said that saturated fat is the single most pro-inflammatory food component because the body is reacting so negatively to the damage it creates. Another reason is an acidic sugar molecule, NEU5GC, which is found in meats, fish, and some dairy products, but it is not found in the human body. So our body sees it as foreign and it tries to combat it, right? It sees it as a threat. our immune cells, it keeps those immune cells activated too when this NEU5GC is shown in our system. And NEU5G is also shown to increase the risk of tumor formation as well. Also, cholesterol is another reason because excess cholesterol triggers an inflammatory response. And this can become a vicious cycle too, because inflammation speeds up the accumulation of cholesterol in our arteries. And cholesterol, in turn, produces more inflammation. So on it goes. Eventually, that deposited cholesterol contributes to a plaque, which can rupture and lead to those blood clots that cause our heart attacks and strokes. Now, plant foods contain zero cholesterol. Let's keep this in mind as we go along. There's no cholesterol in plant foods. Also, factory farmed animals are fed a diet high in omega 6 fatty acids, which we just talked about why those are so inflammatory. And studies confirm that the higher the animal protein we eat, the higher levels of inflammatory markers there are in our blood. Meat also contains something called AGEs, or those advanced glycation end products, which also trigger inflammation. And these are harmful compounds that are formed when protein or fat combine with sugar in our bloodstream. That's a process called glycation. So when protein or fat combine with sugar and cause glycation, those AGEs can either form inside our body or they're in the foods that we eat. And even certain cooking methods like frying and grilling can cause the levels of AGEs in meat to skyrocket. And those AGEs are quite inflammatory. Moving on to dairy products now, like milk and butter, cheese and yogurt, ice cream and puddings. All of these foods are pro-inflammatory. And once again, mostly because of the high saturated fat content, with cheese being the highest source of saturated fat in our diet. Plus, the dairy products will have those AGEs that we just talked about, as well as other toxins that our bodies see as foreign and tries to combat them. So, dairy is also a common allergen that can trigger inflammatory responses like stomach distress, skin rashes, hives, and many people don't even realize that they're sensitive or allergic to dairy until they stop consuming it and they realize how much better they feel. Refined grains. We know that whole grains are very health promoting, right? But everything that's made with white refined enriched flour are inflammatory because those grains, that wheat or rye or whatever it is, has been stripped of the outer coating, and that's where all the fiber and nutrition lives. So if we strip away all the fiber and nutrition, that refined grains makes our blood sugar spike and causes that pro-inflammatory chemical reaction that we just talked about called glycation. So other things that can lead to inflammation is the regular consumption of alcohol, which can damage our intestinal lining and lead to a condition called leaky gut. Alcohol also suppresses our immune system and impairs the key functioning of our organs, especially our liver. So the Arthritis Foundation has several warnings about drinking if you're taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs they're called, right? So if you're suffering with inflammation and you're taking NSAID drugs such as ibuprofen and Aleve and acetaminophen, many of these over-the-counter things, I would encourage you to go to the Arthritis Foundation website and see the warnings there about alcohol. If you're drinking alcohol while consuming those products, there are some things there that you would need to know about. And we don't have time to get into that today, but I encourage you to go explore that. Food additives and artificial sweeteners like MSG and aspartame. Again, the body sees all of those man-made products as foreign threats, and so it dispatches immune cells to try to combat them. And people suffering from RA, rheumatoid arthritis, are especially susceptible to inflammation that's triggered by food additives. The last thing I'll talk about here, which causes inflammation, is fill in the blank. This would be any food sensitivity or allergy that someone might have. And the most common are gluten, dairy, nuts, eggs, and nightshade vegetables. All right, is that enough bad news now? Let's get into some good news, right?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's talk about anti-inflammatory foods that we can eat freely and feel good about. Starches like potatoes, beans, rice, legumes, and whole grains. All of these foods contain anti-inflammatory properties like resistant starch, fiber, anthocyanins, and flavonoids. And beans are especially good sources of folic acid and antioxidants. And all of these foods are super high in fiber too. So remember how we said saturated fat is the most pro-inflammatory food component? Well, fiber is the single most anti-inflammatory food component, and fiber is only found in plants. There's no fiber in meat, dairy, and cheese and all of that. So, vegetables, fruits, mushrooms, and dark greens, all of these foods are high in antioxidants, lycopene, flavonoids, carotenoids, fiber again, folic acid, as well as other nutrients, all of which are anti-inflammatory properties. So go for a wide range of color in your veggies and fruits. That way you're getting lots of these phytochemicals. Whole grains like steel cut oats, brown rice, barley, quinoa, buckwheat, and wild rice. All of these whole grains are high in fiber and they boost the immune system by feeding our good gut bacteria, right? Whole soy foods, which are filled with isoflavones, omega 3s, and phytoestrogens. Phytoestrogen simply means plant estrogen, and there's no need to be concerned about estrogen as we would be with dairy estrogen. And I've got an article about that on my website if you want to explore that. And if you go to the search bar and type in, is soy safe? You'll find that article about soy foods. Whole soy foods are very good. It's the isolated soy protein that can contribute to problems, inflammation included. And you'll find isolated soy protein in like fake burgers, protein shakes once in a while. Just make sure you're reading your labels to make sure a power bar or something does not have isolated soy protein. Whole soy foods, though, like tofu and edamame and soy milk and miso and tempeh, all of those foods are very anti-inflammatory. Um, but they should be purchased organic if you can, at least non-GMO for soy products. I would recommend that. If you want to make a tofu-based chocolate pudding or a marinated stir fry with marinated tofu, you know, that's totally acceptable.
And you've got some great recipes on your website, haven't you? Including some scrumptious dessert.
I do, yes. Yeah. There's a chocolate orange ice cream dessert. I like to make nice creams in the summer. And so I've got a lot of those recipes on there too. Nuts and seeds too, like almonds, walnuts, and Brazil nuts, chia seeds, ground flaxseed, sunflower seeds. All of these foods are anti-inflammatory due to the omega-3, the magnesium, the vitamin E content. Then we have the herbs and spices too. A lot of spices are really powerful antioxidants. They contain all these compounds that are known to lower inflammation, especially like garlic, turmeric, ginger, curry, and cinnamon. Another anti-inflammatory thing to consider is green tea, because it's a very rich source of polyphenols and catechins, including one property called epigalactocatechin 3 gallate. EGCG3 for short, which is really potent for anti-inflammatory effects. Purchase high quality tea and correctly brew it for maximum health benefits. So overall, whole plant foods, which we highly promote, and Jane is promoting as well, whole plant foods containing fiber. And again, fiber is the most anti-inflammatory food component. Beans, legumes, split peas, chickpeas, lentils, whole grains, all are wonderful sources of fiber. And fiber releases something called butyrate into our bloodstream, which provides broad anti-inflammatory effects throughout the entire body. And as a reminder, once again, fiber is only found in plant foods. So the higher a fiber is, again, related to a lower risk of arthritis, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. The RDA for fiber is about 32 grams a day, and less than 3% of Americans are getting that amount. In fact, they're getting half of that, about 15 to 17 grams a day. The healthiest people on earth, studies show, are getting at least 45 grams of fiber a day through their food.
Yeah, I mean, I think if people listening to this, watching this, if they want to increase their fiber, you need to do it actually slowly. I don't mean taking years, but taking several weeks, because if you increase the fiber content of your food very suddenly, then you can have all sorts of problems with gas, with stomach cramps and things like that, because your body's not used to it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You just need to do it at a pace. So every week increasing the amount of fiber that's in your diet.
I do know people that have jumped in overnight and switched their diet overnight, and they did not have any issues. So, but if
Oh,
it does
right.
bother you, then definitely go slow. And there are things you can do like pre-soaking beans to alleviate that. So a whole food plant-based diet is going to give you 50, 60, or even more grams of health-promoting fiber each day. And again, fiber is only found in plants. So what can you do about it if you suspect that you have inflammation going on somewhere in your body? Well, there's a blood test that you can have checked your CRP levels. CRP stands for C-reactive protein, and it's a measurement of chronic inflammation going on somewhere in your body. I won't tell you where, but C-reactive protein is produced in our liver, and the levels rise when inflammation is present in our body. But the medical community is saying that if you have a baseline level of just 2 or 3 milligrams per liter of CRP, that means that you're set up for an increased risk of heart attack or stroke. And if you're 3 or higher, then you're at a high risk. So the levels of most middle-aged Americans unfortunately exceed the ideal number of 1, suggesting that most of us are indeed suffering from some type of chronic inflammation. Typically, diet is the biggest factor, and it's the biggest determinant of our health status, even more than our genetics are. So if inflammatory foods, if you're consuming a lot of those, that might be the place to start. The optimal solution would be to start changing the foods that you're consuming. Other lifestyle changes would be to quit smoking. Exercise is really important. Doesn't mean you have to run marathons, but get active, start walking, start doing some things. That'll help you reduce your stress levels as well, because stress levels can contribute to inflammation. And also reducing body fat. If you've got some weight to lose, adopting this type of diet plan would actually help with that as well. Studies have shown that obesity is strongly associated with increased CRP levels too, right? We just talked about the CRP levels.
Mm.
In obesity, the more heavy we are, the more our CRP levels are likely to become. So just being overweight is a contributor to inflammation. But again, the biggest and best thing you could do is to start consuming the most anti-inflammatory and health-promoting diet out there, one that's high in fiber with densely nutritious whole plant foods, which can reduce CRP levels by 30% in just 2 weeks. So here's just a few of our anti-inflammatory meals, because we're not talking about salads and tree bark, right? That's what a lot of people think that a plant-based diet is about. So I like to show some of our favorite meals: barbecued lentil loaf with mashed potatoes and gravy, a creamy chili pasta, lots of plant-based burgers, usually bean-based or grain-based, sloppy joes, stir fries, hearty chili and cornbread, African peanut stew, lasagna roll-ups,
Wow.
cheesy Mexican tortilla bake, plant-based sorbets, chocolate mousse. And I hope by showing these photos that anti-inflammatory foods are anything but bland and boring. All of these meals are highly anti-inflammatory.
Well, this looks like very yummy, yummy food. And I think you've got
Mhm.
a lot of these recipes on your website, haven't you?
I'm not a recipe creator, though. I've created maybe 12 recipes of my own, but I
Right.
am a recipe sharer. I share the recipes that I do like in my weekly newsletter. I always share a new recipe that I've tried, and it has to pass my palate and my husband's palate, and he's picky. He's a picky eater. He's not here right now, so I can talk about him. But he is very selective, and so if it passes his okay test and my okay test, then it goes into the keeper file. So I only
Right.
share recipes from my keeper file. So there's my website, sidnotter.com. My email is sidnotter@sidnotter.com if you have any questions for me. I've got a free webinar on my website called 3 Food Mistakes That Lead to Painful Joints, Extra Pounds, and Health Problems the Doctors Aren't Solving. Free 21-day meal plan, 10 simple dessert smoothies like a banana split smoothie, a chocolate avocado shake, all of those good things. Signed copies of my book, The Plan A Diet, combining whole food plant-based nutrition with the timeless wisdom of scripture. You can get signed copies of that there. And on the courses tab, you'll have access to this full-blown. Today, you're just getting a snippet. This was a 90-minute class that I taught at our college, which included label reading tips and how you could tell at a glance if a product contains inflammatory foods. I talk about that in the longer course. That's on my courses tab, as well as Age Well with Strong Bones, a cooking class that I did with 2 other chefs. I made an Italian pizza burger because I'm Italian,
Right.
and I made a Southwest burger with green chili sauce. So that course is on my website. And there's also a course there called Food, Faith, and Fulfilling Your Purpose with 23 other speakers, all talking on that topic. I've been teaching this for over 25 years. So I've got a real heart to help people. I'm 68 years old, and I know if I was not eating this way, I'd be going down my dire family history path right now. I'd be on a ton of drugs. I would not be in good shape by history of my family for sure. But I know it's the way that we eat that keeps me, in top health. And
Yeah.
I praise God for that, because that doesn't mean you're immune from ever getting sick or you could never get a disease. You still could, but the chances are much greater if you're eating in the American diet versus, a whole food plant-based diet.
Yeah.
Plant-based diet totally lowers your risk for every disease.
So if people listening to all this, there's lots and lots of great information, and they go, I want to start, but it's all a bit overwhelming. Is there
Mhm.
one place you would recommend them to start, or does it vary from person to person?
I would say do not be overwhelmed that you have to find hundreds of recipes at once. Find 6 or 8 recipes that you like first and repeat them. Take one step forward, add a new recipe every week to see if it's going to be one of your keepers, right? Because it can be overwhelming when you think you're going to change the whole way you shop and cook. It can be overwhelming. Give yourself a week of prep time. Okay, next Monday, I'm going to start this. But until then, I'm going to be looking at my recipes. I'm going to maybe stock up on some ingredients I don't have. Always have healthy food in the refrigerator. Don't let yourself get to where there's nothing good to eat in the house or it's easy to backtrack. So there's got to be a plan. Planning is the key. I have tips on that on my website, meal planning, how to plan it out. I've got 4 mental tips to stay motivated for when you start, the motivation starts waning. Like, why do you want to do this? What are your big whys, your reasons for this? It's usually health or animal concern, animal welfare or planetary concerns. Those are the 3 big ones.
Mm.
But the people that come to me for coaching, it's health. They are usually in their 50s and they've been diagnosed with some new malady that, is scaring them. Some of them are even from the healthcare field, they're nurses and so forth. So they know that plant-based eating would offer a better alternative for them and they want to learn how to do it.
I love how practical you are, but also you understand the science behind it as well. So you've got that lovely combination of down to earth practicality plus the scientific knowledge.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that if you keep yourself educated, that's a big motivator, right? When you know how this is affecting your body, it's much easier to stick with a healthy diet when you know that those bad foods are contributing to your eczema or, whatever.
So thank you very, very much indeed. I've really enjoyed talking to you, listening to you. I've learned stuff and I thought I knew quite a lot.
Thank you, Jane. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to be on your show today.